Summer had begun, and I didn't think my break before the next university semester would start with an argument with David. We sat in the kitchen, and the silence between us wasn't just uncomfortable. It felt like there was something more, as if each of us was afraid to say something wrong. David looked tired, and I was on edge. This argument had started because of my trip to Canada, but it was about more than just a discussion about travel. "Sarah, I just think it's not the best idea right now," he said calmly, almost pleadingly. "I'd prefer if you stayed home. I know you're worried, but I need a break." I tried to hold back my irritation, not wanting to sound harsh. "It's just a trip to Uncle Jack's, and he lives by the lake. It's only for a couple of weeks." He sighed and turned away. I knew he wasn't thrilled about the idea, but I didn't understand why it mattered so much. I needed time for myself. I could feel that in my bones. University, studying, responsibilities, it all piled up, and I felt like I had no time to just relax and really experience life. On the surface, David and I had everything going well. We took care of each other, supported each other. But lately, I increasingly felt like we were losing our emotional connection. We talked about chores, weekend plans, but never about each other. The feeling of loneliness was overwhelming, especially when I realized how easily and casually we had come to treat physical closeness. It was no longer something that brought us closer, something that sparked excitement and passion. We were just living, as if by schedule, without real desire or sincerity. "Maybe this is a good opportunity to spend a little time apart," I suggested with a smile, trying to keep it gentle. "We're always together, and sometimes it's good to take a little break from each other to realize how important it is." David looked at me, and I saw a flicker of worry in his eyes, but he still said nothing. He just nodded and went to the bedroom. I knew that, in truth, he just didn't want to discuss it any further. He often did that, avoided conversations that might be unpleasant. My parents' words echoed in my head. "You need a change of scenery, a distraction," my mom said when I told her that studying was exhausting me, that I felt more and more lost. They suggested I go to Canada to Uncle Jack's, a place where I could relax and be alone with nature. It seemed like a good solution. I stayed alone in the kitchen, and from the room next door, I heard the bedroom door close. Inside, I felt a slight sense of relief that I had made a decision. Even if David wasn't thrilled, I believed this trip would help me figure things out. I needed space to understand what I was missing and where I had lost the connection that once bound me to my husband. Maybe this trip would help make sense of it all. Uncle Jack's house was just as I imagined, wooden, cozy, with windows facing the lake. The air here was fresh and cool, the scent of pine trees mixed with the slight dampness of the lake, and this feeling of comfort and tranquility enveloped me like a warm blanket. I chose this trip to find time for myself, but upon arriving here, I suddenly felt that maybe I was also searching for something new, something unknown. Jack met me on the porch, his eyes squinting slightly from the bright sun. He looked just as I remembered, tall, with a bit of gray in his hair that added to his charisma. He always had a certain calmness, an inner confidence that drew people to him. He smiled at me, warmly and genuinely. "Hi, Sarah." His voice was low and soft. "Glad you decided to come. I hope you find some peace here." "Hi, Jack," I smiled back, feeling a sense of ease in his presence. "I'm glad too. I think I really need it right now." I noticed how his gaze lingered on me a little longer than necessary, and for a moment I felt a bit uneasy, but I quickly brushed the thought aside. We exchanged a few words, and he helped me bring my suitcase into the house. I went upstairs to my room. Inside, everything was just as I remembered. Warm wooden tones, small decorations like seashells I had seen here as a child. This place seemed unchanged despite the passing years. In the evening, Jack invited me to dinner. He made something simple but delicious, pasta with sauce and a salad. We sat at a small table in the living room overlooking the lake, calm and quiet in the evening light. The conversation flowed easily, but beneath the surface of our words there was something unspoken, a kind of tension that neither of us wanted to touch. "How's school?" Jack asked, serving himself some salad. "You're finishing next year, right?" "Yeah, that's right," I smiled, glad to talk about something familiar and straightforward. "The last year is coming up and it's a little scary. I'm not sure I'm ready for the next stage." Jack nodded. His gaze was soft, almost fatherly. But there was also something else there, something I couldn't quite place. He looked calm, but it seemed like there was something deeper beneath that calmness. "You'll do great," he said quietly. "You've always been a strong girl." There was something in his voice that made me pause for a second and look at his face. His words felt not only supportive but also somehow more personal. I suddenly felt the warmth of his words as if they had wrapped around me, and that warmth left a pleasant but also troubling feeling inside. We finished dinner and I helped clear the table. Jack offered to make tea and we continued talking about more general topics, but the tension in the air remained. When evening came and I went upstairs to my room, I felt like something important had started in this house. Perhaps this trip would change more than I expected. The evening was slowly coming to an end, and I had gone upstairs to my room, feeling a light tiredness after a day filled with fresh air and relaxed conversations with Uncle Jack. The sun had already disappeared behind the horizon, leaving a soft twilight glow filtering through the curtains. I decided to take a shower and change into my pajamas to finally relax. The room was quiet and peaceful, and I enjoyed this solitude. I slipped out of my daytime clothes and decided to change into clean underwear to feel more comfortable after the long day. Just as I had taken off both my daytime clothes and underwear and was reaching for clean ones from the dresser, I suddenly heard a light knock on the door. I barely managed to turn my head when the door opened slightly and Jack peeked inside. "Oh, sorry." He froze instantly as if struck speechless, his gaze lingering on me for a moment, almost involuntarily. At that moment, it caught me off guard. His eyes met mine, and I saw a flicker of confusion in them, something I couldn't quite define. For a moment, we both froze. I felt my heart start beating faster, and the air in the room seemed heavier. It felt like time had stopped, but only for a second because in the next moment he looked away and immediately stepped back, closing the door. "Sorry, Sarah, I didn't mean to—" His voice sounded muffled from behind the door, and a second later I heard his footsteps moving away. I stood still, trying to gather my thoughts. It all happened so quickly that I didn't even know how to react. A tremor of anxiety ran through my body, and I hurried to put on my pajamas, trying to calm the sudden shakiness in my hands. But no matter how hard I tried, the thoughts wouldn't leave me. Something about that moment felt strange, so intimate that it was hard to push the memory away. There was more in his gaze than just confusion. It was full of contradictions. On the one hand, it was something involuntary, simple surprise, and on the other, something deeper that left a mark on me. His eyes, filled with warmth and light bewilderment, suddenly seemed especially close to me. I tried to distract myself. I opened a book I had brought with me and settled into bed, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that moment. The feeling of slight tension, his gaze, my own embarrassment, all of it created a turmoil in my head that I didn't know how to handle. I felt that despite the apologies and the attempt to return everything to normal, some invisible boundary had already been crossed between us. Something had changed, even if it was just 1 second when we both allowed ourselves to linger in that situation longer than we should have. We both knew it was an accident, yet that accident left a mark. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, thinking about how to behave around Jack from now on. It seemed that everything should remain as it was before, no barriers, no doubts between us. But that small moment changed something in my perception. Maybe I was just looking for a reason to escape my own thoughts and worries related to my marriage. Or maybe there was really something about this house that was changing both of us. The morning began with a soft light filtering through the curtains, filling the room with warmth and a sense of freshness. Outside, I could hear the muffled sound of water splashing and birds singing. I looked out the window and saw sunlight playing on the surface of the lake. Everything around seemed peaceful, as if it had been created to give me a break from everything happening in my life. Coming downstairs, I found Uncle Jack making coffee. He smiled at me, and there was no trace of yesterday's awkwardness on his face. Everything seemed as if nothing had happened, and perhaps that was exactly what I wanted. "Good morning, Sarah. I hope you slept well." His voice was calm and warm. "Good morning, Jack. Yes, thank you." I smiled back and sat at the table. We had coffee, talking about little things until Jack suddenly suggested, You know, the lake is especially beautiful this morning. Would you like to take a walk with me along the shore? I think it would be a great way to start the day." I agreed, and we set off along the path that ran by the lake. The air was fresh, a light breeze swayed the branches of the trees, and everything seemed wonderfully harmonious. We walked side by side, and our conversation gradually became more personal. "What are your plans for the future, Sarah?" Jack suddenly asked, breaking the silence. I paused for a moment, looking at the water. "I'm not sure yet. I'll finish university and then—" I sighed. "I feel like I still haven't found what I want to do. All these expectations, all this uncertainty. Sometimes it weighs on me. Sometimes I just want to go far away from it all." I smiled, trying to lighten my words with a joke. Jack listened silently, nodding. There was understanding in his eyes, and I felt comfortable sharing my doubts with him. He had a way of listening that made me not feel embarrassed by my words. "Sometimes it's okay not to know what you want," he said, stopping for a moment and looking at me. "Life doesn't always have to be a clear plan. It's important to find what makes you happy, not just follow someone else's expectations." I felt his words resonate within me, as if he had expressed something I hadn't been able to realize myself. I looked at him and noticed something in his eyes, warm, almost caring, but at the same time there was something else that made me feel a slight tension. We kept walking, and suddenly I felt him take my arm, firmly but gently. The gesture was so natural, as if he wanted to support me, to show me that I wasn't alone. But at the same time it felt too intimate. My heart began to beat a little faster, and I felt a slight shiver run through my arm. I didn't pull away, but my thoughts raced through my mind. This gesture seemed like more than just support, and I couldn't quite understand what was bothering me. We kept walking, and I tried to act like nothing had happened. But inside me grew the feeling that something was changing between us, something I wasn't ready to acknowledge just yet. In the morning, I decided to call David. We hadn't had a proper conversation in a while, and I wanted to tell him how things were going. He answered quickly, and his voice sounded familiar, as if we talked every day. "Hi, David. How are you?" I tried to put warmth into my voice to smooth over our last argument. "Hey, Sarah. I'm fine. How's Canada?" His question was simple, yet I felt some distance in it. "It's good here." I paused for a second, choosing my words. I didn't realize how much I needed this break. The lake, the silence, the chance to be alone. It's really helping. "I'm glad to hear that." He seemed genuinely happy for me. "Maybe you'll come back when you feel you've rested enough?" "Yeah, of course," I replied. But there was something uncertain in my voice. I wasn't ready to go back to the same routine, the same conversations. This sense of freedom I had here turned out to be something I wasn't willing to give up so soon. We talked a bit more about everyday things, and then our conversation ended. I didn't feel the closeness we once had, and while he cared for me, I realized that something was lost, and I didn't know how to get it back. In the evening, Jack suggested we make dinner together. It was a good activity to distract myself from my internal struggles. We were making pasta, and I was chopping vegetables while Jack heated the sauce. The kitchen was filled with the aroma of garlic and fresh herbs, creating an atmosphere of warmth and comfort, but the tension between us was still there. "Do you miss David?" Jack asked, trying not to look at me. I paused for a moment, considering his words. "Yeah, I do," I answered, not lifting my eyes from the vegetables. "But sometimes it feels like we've grown too distant. I don't know how to explain it. It's like I love him, but at the same time I'm losing what we used to have." There was doubt in my voice, and I couldn't hide it. Jack didn't say anything, but his silence wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, as if he knew what I was talking about, even if he couldn't find the words to express it. I looked up and met his eyes. He was looking at me, and there was so much sympathy in his gaze, and something else. Deeper, more personal. I felt the tension between us growing, and in the next second, as if following some impulse, Jack stepped toward me and took my shoulders. I didn't have time to say anything before he moved closer, and his lips touched mine. It was a short but passionate kiss. It seemed to explode the silence between us, filling it with unspoken feelings. I didn't pull away, but I didn't know how to respond either. Everything inside me was mixed: doubts, excitement, fear, and something indescribably pleasant. We both froze for a moment, and then Jack stepped back, his eyes still on me with a glimmer in them as if he was trying to understand what I felt. "Just don't tell your parents about this, okay?" He smiled, and there was a hint of irony in his voice. "Hope you enjoyed it." I looked at him stunned, not knowing what to say. Everything about this moment was so unexpected and mixed, tension, closeness, and now his joke, that I felt everything inside me turn upside down. I tried to smile back, but it came out strained. "Jack," I began, but I couldn't find the words. Silence fell over us again, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was now a new, invisible bond between us that couldn't be ignored. Without saying another word, we both went our separate ways. I went upstairs to my room, trying to understand what had just happened and what I was supposed to do now. That night turned out to be one of the most restless for me. Lying in bed, I tried to sort out my feelings, but instead, I only became more aware of how much everything had changed. That kiss had become a new boundary we had crossed, and now there was no turning back. The morning started off heavy. I couldn't forget that kiss. His warm lips, the way he looked at me afterward. Playful, yet inscrutable. That feeling had stayed with me from the moment I opened my eyes. A sense of guilt started creeping in, growing stronger by the hour. I felt I had to talk to David, if only to maintain the appearance of normality. Sitting in the living room, I dialed his number. This time he didn't answer right away. I could hear him sigh heavily before greeting me. "Hey, Sarah." His voice was quiet but still familiar, and it both comforted me and made me feel even more pressure. "Hi, David," I smiled, trying to sound as natural as possible. "How are you?" "Nothing new, just work as always," he replied, and there was nothing special in his voice, no suspicion, no tension. "And you?" "I'm good," I lied, and my words felt hollow. "I'm planning to hike up to the mountains today. It's so beautiful here, I think it'll be great. Just trying to make the most of this time." I tried to make my voice sound cheerful, but inside everything was trembling. It felt like even over the phone, David could sense my unease. I listened as he said something encouraging, and I felt a growing sense of distance, not just between us, but within myself. After our brief conversation, we said our goodbyes, and I felt an emptiness wash over me as soon as the call ended. Jack was trying to avoid me. He pretended to be busy with his own things, and I didn't take the initiative to start a conversation. We both knew what had happened, and neither of us knew what to do next. Our gazes still occasionally met, and every time I saw in his eyes something more than just embarrassment or awkwardness. It was something deep, personal, but like me, he wasn't in a hurry to talk about it. I wanted to bring back a sense of normalcy, to regain the comfort that had once been between us. One morning, I suggested that we go for a hike in the mountains, thinking it might help ease the tension. "Jack, how about a hike to the mountains? It'll be great weather today." I tried to smile, hoping he would agree. He looked up from his papers, but after looking at me, he shook his head. "Sorry, Sarah, I can't today. I have a lot of work to do." His voice sounded distant, and there was something final in his refusal. I felt a slight disappointment, but didn't insist. A hike alone could also be a good opportunity to escape from all these complicated thoughts and figure out my feelings. Gathering my things, I headed to the mountains. Surrounded by majestic slopes and nature, I suddenly felt an incredible sense of relief. The fresh wind brushed against my face, and the sounds of the forest filled the air with a living hum. For a while, I managed to forget about Jack, about David, about the emotions tearing me apart. I walked along the trail, looked at the world around me, and allowed myself to simply be, without obligations, without expectations, without guilt. This hike felt like a breath of fresh air, and by the time I returned home, I felt a little lighter, as if the trip had helped me regain some part of my inner peace. But that night, lying in bed, tired after a long day, I once again found my thoughts drifting back to that moment in the kitchen. Remembering the taste of his lips, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something right about that kiss, despite all its forbidden nature. The memories of that moment filled me with both fear and a warmth I couldn't quite define. Lying in the darkness, I tried not to think about it, but the harder I tried, the stronger the realization became that something had changed between us, something that could no longer be denied. A few days had passed, and the tension between Jack and me had started to ease. We began to interact more naturally again, talking about little things, doing chores, even laughing about small misunderstandings. Jack gradually withdrew from the awkwardness, and it felt like we had finally managed to restore the familiar comfort we once had. One morning, as the sun barely rose above the horizon, Jack approached me in the kitchen where I was making coffee. "Sarah, I've been thinking that we should take a little hike," he said, looking out the window at another sunny day. "There's this beautiful spot, Lake Louise. It's not too far, and the view there is just amazing. I think you'd love it." I smiled, feeling a slight excitement at his suggestion. Lake Louise, one of the most beautiful places in Canada, and I'd long wanted to see it. This hike seemed like the perfect opportunity to escape everything that had been troubling me lately. We set off early in the morning, enjoying the cool breeze and fresh air. The road to the lake was scenic, mountain peaks rose in the distance, and lush green forests surrounded us, as if protecting us from all worries and problems. We weren't in a hurry, and the ease that we once had between us slowly began to return. We joked, shared stories, and for the first time in a long while, I felt lighthearted. When we reached the summit, an incredible view of Lake Louise opened up before us. The smooth surface of the water reflected the sky and the surrounding mountains, creating the impression that we were standing in front of a giant mirror. We stopped to admire the view, and for a while, silence settled between us, the kind that didn't need words. "You're right. This place is amazing," I said quietly, not taking my eyes off the lake. "It's so peaceful here. I almost forgot what it's like to feel part of something bigger than just everyday worries." Jack listened silently, and I suddenly felt like I wanted to share something more personal with him than just memories of what I had seen on my journey. "You know, Jack," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "Lately, I've been feeling lost in my marriage, in my life. I love David, but sometimes it feels like we're just coexisting without really feeling each other. I don't know how to bring back what we once had." The words came out on their own, and I felt relieved that I had finally spoken up. Jack turned to me, looking at me with such sincerity and warmth that I couldn't help but meet his gaze. "Sarah, you're not alone in feeling lost," he said softly. "Sometimes we all lose ourselves. The important thing is not to be afraid to search for what makes us happy." He reached out and gently touched my shoulder, as if trying to support me in that moment. The touch was so tender and comforting that I didn't pull away. Instead, I allowed myself to stay in that moment, there with Jack in that beautiful place where I could just be myself. For a moment, I felt that despite everything that was going on inside me, I wasn't alone. And while I didn't know what would happen next, in that moment, I felt that I could trust Jack. And that feeling brought me peace. Returning from our hike to Lake Louise, I felt an extraordinary lightness. Everything that had been troubling me for the past few days had temporarily receded. Jack and I decided to make a special dinner, cook something nice, open a bottle of wine, and enjoy the evening, holding on to that feeling of peace and comfort. Jack suggested we make steak with vegetables, and I immediately agreed, happy at the idea. When I went upstairs to change for dinner, I remembered that I had brought my dressy clothes, a black short skirt and a sheer blouse. At the time, it seemed like I had taken them just for variety, but now I felt that tonight could be special. I wanted to look more beautiful than ever, and as I put on those clothes, I felt a sense of excitement. Not for nothing did I bring them, I thought, looking at my reflection in the mirror. Coming downstairs, I noticed Jack freeze for a moment as he saw me. There was surprise in his eyes and something else, deeper. He didn't say anything, just smiled, and I smiled back, feeling the tension between us reignite. The evening started easily. We cooked together, exchanged jokes, talked about travel and life in general. The wine slowly did its work, making us relax and forget all conventions. We sat at the table, enjoying the food and the taste of the red wine, which seemed to bring out our feelings and thoughts, giving the moment a special significance. There was a kind of magic between us, something special. We both knew that something important was happening, but neither of us dared to speak of it. Jack looked at me, and in his eyes was the same sense of inevitability that I felt inside. Everything happened so suddenly. Our eyes met, and a moment later, he reached for me before I could even think. His lips touched mine, and in that moment, all doubts disappeared. This kiss wasn't just about passion. There was something much more in it, something I had been looking for so long. We didn't even realize how we ended up in his room, how everything turned into that night, full of passion and tenderness. I felt his touch fill the emptiness that had long lived inside me. He was gentle, his hands caressed me as if he were afraid to lose this moment. But along with the pleasure came contradictions. I knew I was doing something wrong, but I couldn't stop. It seemed that at that moment I had finally found what I had lost in my life, a real closeness that I hadn't felt in a long time. That night was incredible, full of emotions I hadn't experienced in a long time. We were together, and in that intimacy, there was everything I had been searching for. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the thought that it was all a mistake, one that I would have to pay for. In the morning, I woke up before him. Light filtered through the gaps in the curtains, and I watched him lying beside me. We avoided talking about what had happened, as if we were afraid to shatter the fragile silence. I could see he felt the same way. We both knew we had gone too far, and there was no going back. I carefully got up, dressed, and went to the kitchen to make coffee. I needed to do something to keep myself from thinking. As soon as I turned on the coffee maker, my phone buzzed on the table, a message from David. "I miss you, Sarah." The words seemed to make me freeze. My husband, my home, all of it was there, in another life. And now I realized that I couldn't just return to that serenity. Everything had changed, and I still didn't know what to do next. I still held my phone in my hand, reading David's message. "I miss you, Sarah." A heaviness spread through me. Not the kind that comes from care and love, but the kind that reminds you of a rift growing more and more obvious. But I didn't have time to dwell on these thoughts, as Jack appeared in the kitchen doorway. "What do you say about a boat ride?" he asked with a slight smile, nodding towards the lake. I quickly put my phone down on the table, almost as if I feared it held all the feelings I was trying to escape. A flutter of excitement rose inside me. I nodded, trying not to show just how much I wanted to be near him, despite all the prohibitions and inner conflicts. The lake was as quiet and peaceful as it had been that day we went for our first walk. We lowered the boat into the water, and Jack began rowing, while I sat watching the sun's reflection dance on the water's surface. It felt like everything around was holding its breath, nature, the forest, the lake, as if we were the only ones left in this world, closed off from everyone else. Jack stopped in a secluded spot, surrounded by dense trees and reeds, as if nature had created this quiet haven just for us. We both knew there was no point in pretending anymore that nothing was happening between us. Jack slowly leaned towards me, and the next moment our lips met, this time without hesitation or shyness. Everything was real. I felt his hands gently touch my back, and my body responded, forgetting all prohibitions and obligations. We sat there for a long time, holding each other, kissing, and forgetting about everything else. Time seemed to stop, and the entire world was somewhere far away. In that moment, I even forgot that Jack was my uncle, that this was wrong. He wasn't my uncle. He was someone who understood me, who was there for me when I needed it most. In his arms, I felt alive, real, and I didn't want it to end. "I can't let you go, Sarah," Jack suddenly whispered, his voice barely audible, but every word echoed in my heart. "Ever since you came here, everything has changed. You make my life better, and I don't want it to end." I looked at him, feeling my heart tighten. His words touched me so deeply that I didn't know how to respond. I knew this was wrong, that it shouldn't have happened. This trip was supposed to be just a break, a chance to escape from everyday life. But now everything had taken such a turn that I was losing control of my feelings and actions. We returned to the shore late in the evening, and once again that tension arose between us, a nearly painful desire to be closer to each other. We approached the shore, and Jack helped me out of the boat, his hands lingering on my waist for a moment. In that touch, there was everything: his desire, his fear of losing me. I looked at him, and we could no longer hold back. His lips found mine again, and I allowed myself to drown in that moment, forgetting everything else. On the shore, we gave in to our feelings, and I knew that these moments would haunt me. I let myself enjoy this moment, forgetting about what awaited me, about David, and about what would happen when this trip was over. I allowed myself to be here now with Jack, the person who had suddenly become everything to me. The morning began as usual. Sunlight filled the room through the thin curtains, birds chirped outside, and the air was quiet, hiding all the feelings and secret desires that had built up between Jack and me. I was making coffee in the kitchen when the phone rang. I looked at the screen and saw my mom's name. For a moment, I hesitated, as if something inside me protested against returning to reality, but then I answered. "Hi, Mom." I tried to make my voice sound as calm and cheerful as possible. "Hi, sweetheart." Her voice was warm, and for a moment it warmed my heart. "How are you doing there? Have you had enough rest? Your dad and I think it's time for you to come home. We miss you, and David has asked a few times when you're coming back." Those words filled me with a heaviness, pulling me back to the reality I had been trying to escape all this time. Home, my husband. Everything that was familiar and safe now felt foreign. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. "Yes, Mom, I think you're right," I muttered. "It's time to come back." We talked a little more, discussing the details of my return, and then I hung up feeling completely drained. Was this it? Jack? Our time together, was it all supposed to end? Was everything I found here supposed to be left behind? At that moment, Jack walked into the kitchen, seeing me standing with the phone in my hand, staring out the window. He stepped closer, noticing my downcast expression. "What happened?" he asked, frowning slightly. I turned to him and our eyes met. In his eyes, there was a question and fear that I felt as strongly as he did. "It was my mom," I said quietly. "She said it's time for me to come home. David's been asking about my return, too." Jack froze for a moment. Then, as if making a decision, he stepped closer and took my hands. His gaze was full of pain and a sense of hopelessness. "Sarah, I don't know how to live without you," he said, his voice barely audible, but each word seemed to echo in my heart. "Everything I felt, everything I've been searching for, it's all you. Since you came here, my life has had meaning, and I don't want to go back to what it was before." His words pierced me, and I felt my heart tighten with pain. I knew he was right, that I felt the same, but I also knew this situation couldn't last forever. I had a husband, and in some way I still loved him, or at least wanted to get back what we once had. Jack looked at me, and there was a hint of resignation in his eyes. "But I also understand that sooner or later you would have to leave," he continued, struggling to get the words out. "Maybe everything we've had will just be warm memories. We'll meet at family gatherings, pretend nothing ever happened, and move on. I know that's inevitable, and if that's all we have left, I'm ready to accept it, because you've given me more than I could ever ask for." His words touched me even more deeply. There was not only pain in his voice, but also the realization that our connection, no matter how important it was, would have to stay in the past. I felt tears fill my eyes, and unable to hold back, I hugged him. We stood there in silence, holding each other tightly, knowing this moment might be one of the last times we could be so close. "I'll talk to David," I said quietly, unsure if I even knew how to do it. "But I don't know what to say to him. I don't know what will happen next." Jack looked at me with a kind of longing, his eyes seeming to try to penetrate the depths of my soul to find the answer to all his questions. He let go of my hands and took a step back, as if realizing that from here he could no longer help me. Silence fell between us again, full of contradictions and unspoken words. I knew I had to go home and that I had to talk to David, but what to say to him, how to explain what had happened, and to understand what I wanted myself, it all seemed impossible. All I knew for sure was that my life would never be the same, and perhaps this was the moment when I finally had to make a choice that would change everything. The morning began with a heavy feeling that wouldn't leave me. I knew I had to talk to David. He was waiting for my return, and I felt that I could no longer avoid facing reality. His message reminded me that everything Jack and I were doing here was just a temporary escape from the world, a world that would eventually demand answers. Gathering my courage, I started the video call and saw David's face on the screen. He looked tired but tried to smile. I tried not to reveal my inner turmoil and kept my composure as best I could. "Hi, Sarah," he said, smiling. "I'm so glad to see you. How are you?" "Hi, David," I replied with a strained smile. "I'm okay. How are you?" He began talking about work, about the neighbors asking when I would be back. His words sounded so mundane, but each of them echoed inside me with emptiness, reminding me that my life here was completely different. I stood, answering with short phrases, and then, trying to fill the awkward silence, I began doing some household chores, picking up a cloth and dusting the shelves. After a few minutes of conversation, there was silence. We just looked at each other through the screen, and it felt almost unbearable. David sat in his chair watching me, and at some point I averted my gaze, feeling that I could no longer bear his look. Anxiety grew inside me. It was at that moment, when the room fell into silence, that the door quietly opened. Jack entered, his steps light and confident, and he didn't look at the laptop. Perhaps he didn't even notice it. He approached me from behind and, unaware that I was still connected with David, wrapped his arms around my waist. "Hey, beautiful," he whispered softly in my ear, his voice filled with warmth. I felt his arms hold me tightly, and before I could do anything, Jack turned me towards him and, without saying a word, confidently kissed me on the lips. That kiss was full of passion and tenderness. There was no hesitation in it. He didn't see me as his niece. This was the kiss of a man who wanted to express all his feelings, his emotions, his attachment. For a moment, I lost myself in that kiss, as if everything around me disappeared. But then my gaze happened to fall on the laptop screen. On the screen, I saw David's face. His eyes were wide open, and the expression on his face was a mixture of shock and pain that was impossible not to notice. I felt something inside me break. He saw us. Everything crumbled in an instant. Everything I tried to protect, everything I tried to justify to myself. The next second, the screen went black. The connection was lost. I felt my heart tighten and despair rose inside me. "Jack," I whispered, pulling away from him, my hands trembling. I was talking to David." Jack let go of me, his face turning pale, his eyes shifting to the now dark screen of the laptop. Silence fell over the room, an unbearable silence. He didn't know what to say. I saw his expression change as he realized the gravity of what had just happened. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." His voice was quiet, almost inaudible. There was no confidence or passion in it, only the realization that we had gone too far and that consequences were now unavoidable. I looked at the closed laptop, feeling how everything we had tried to build here was falling apart. Our reality, in which only we existed, was collapsing before our eyes. I didn't know what to do next. I didn't know how to explain this to David, how to face him and tell him that everything was a mistake for which I now had to pay. We stood in silence, filled with pain, despair, and the understanding that everything had changed. There was no more comfort between us, no hidden place where we could escape the world. Reality had caught up with us, and now I had to face it head on. The road home felt longer than I remembered. My thoughts were tangled, and I tried to anticipate how David would greet me, how I could explain everything that had happened, but every guess ended in the same uncertainty. I had no idea what awaited me. All I knew for sure was that my life could no longer be the same as before. When I finally reached home, my heart clenched with anxiety. The house looked so familiar yet strangely foreign. I took my suitcase, which felt unusually heavy, and stepped toward the door, feeling that every movement was an effort. David opened the door. He didn't smile. His gaze was cold and distant, and there was none of the warmth that had always welcomed me before. He looked at me like a stranger, and something inside me broke. "Hi," I said quietly, struggling to find the right words. "Hi," he replied, his voice as cold as his gaze. We walked inside, and I noticed that the house was filled with silence, not the comforting kind of silence that exists in a loving home, but a heavy, oppressive one. I set my suitcase by the wall and tried to smile, but my smile found no response. "Do you want to talk?" David asked, looking at me with a kind of indifference. His words felt more like a formality than a genuine desire. I nodded. We sat down in the living room, and an awkward silence hung between us. I tried to find the words to explain what had happened, but nothing appropriate came to mind. David sat across from me, his eyes filled with hurt and anger that he made no effort to hide. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice quiet but filled with pain. "I thought we could fix this. That you just needed time to figure things out. But what I saw... Sarah, it was too much." "I don't know what to say," I replied, my voice trembling. "I was struggling. I felt lost, lonely. I never wanted to hurt you, but it just... happened." "It just happened?" There was bitterness in his voice. "You betrayed me, Sarah. This isn't just a mistake. It's betrayal. And now you think you can just explain it away?" I didn't know what to say. Every word he spoke struck straight at my heart, and I knew I deserved it. I tried to find a glimmer of warmth in his eyes, but there was none. All I saw was hurt and disappointment. David paused for a moment, then looked me straight in the eyes, his face tense. "Tell me, Sarah," he finally said, his voice quiet, but the tension in it made the moment even more serious. "Do you have feelings for Jack? Was this more than just a mistake for you?" I froze, unable to answer. The words were stuck in my throat. I knew that if I told him the truth, I would lose him forever. But I also knew that lying to him would only continue to hurt him. I looked at him and felt everything inside me tear apart. The question was too difficult, and the answer I knew was terrifying. A silence full of pain and despair hung between us. I didn't know what to say, and at that moment the words suddenly slipped out. "Does my answer change anything?" David looked at me with slight surprise, and his expression softened for a moment. He sighed and nodded. "Of course it does," he replied, his voice becoming a bit gentler. "Sarah, I understand that things have been difficult between us lately. I understand that our relationship has been strained, and maybe this was a way to cope. If it was just a kiss, we can get through this. We can fix it." His words were unexpected. He thought it was just a kiss. I hadn't clarified that much more had happened between Jack and me. His willingness to try to make things right, even after what he had seen, left me speechless. Now I was faced with a dilemma. Tell the truth and lose David forever, or lie, downplay what had happened, and try to salvage what we once had. I hesitated, looking at him, unable to decide what to do next. Should I tell the truth or lie to preserve something that might have already been lost?